Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the Peasants Revolt. In this episode, Showdown in Smithfield, we will talk about how a national uprising against the poll tax in 1381 led to remarkable concessions from the monarchy, which ironically led to a split within the rebels, which weakened them going into the final confrontation with the nobles of England. After the death of rebel leader Wat Tyler, the remaining rebels surrendered at Clarkenwell, yet the Peasants Revolt still left behind a powerful legacy. Though the feudal system held firm across Europe for most of the Middle Ages, it started to come unglued during the 1300s, under pressure from the Great Famine, Dynastic War, and most importantly, the Black Death. Peasants rose up across Europe, in Flanders during the 1320s, the Baltic during the 1340s, France in the 1350s, and England in 1381. The uprising in England was caused by a poll tax, which levied 4 pence a head on everybody in the kingdom. After less than 3 weeks, the Peasants' Revolt seized control of London. There, the rebels forced 14-year-old King Richard II not only to effectively abolish the feudal system, but hand over the tax collector-in-chief, Archbishop Simon Sudbury. The rebels cut off the archbishop's head and paraded it through London. He was only one of 400 nobles executed during the revolt. Meanwhile, the uprising continued to spread northwards, as far as York. Up and down the country, townspeople who heard of the uprising overthrew and replaced town governments, ransacked ducal palaces, and attacked the properties of Dominican and Franciscan friaries. As part of his bargain with the rebels, Richard II promised charters of liberty to all villages which participated in the revolt. Richard II lived in a fortified house called the Wardrobe, where a special team of 30 monks gathered to copy out the charters of freedom. As the charters started to go out, the 100,000 rebels in London started to go home. After all, they'd gotten what they wanted, so why stay? If Richard II issued the charters as a ploy to divide the rebels, it worked spectacularly. The peasant army began shrinking fast. Only a core group of Kentish rebels led by Wat Tyler remained, and Tyler demanded a third meeting at Smithfield. At 3 a.m. before the third meeting, the pious Richard II went to pray at the tomb of King Edward the Confessor, knowing that the next 6 hours would make or break his regime. His only remaining weapon was the mystique of the monarchy. The peasants trusted him completely, even if they hated the nobles. That morning, Richard II met with Wat Tyler's rebels at Smithfield, a field outside London where butchers threw away sheep blood and pig innards. William Wallace had been hung, drawn, and quartered there 76 years ago. Richard's men had state-of-the-art equipment. They were clad in steel armor, often made out of plate, and armed with swords, daggers, and maces. Most of them were veterans of the 100 Years' War. Richard had 200 knights, while Tyler had 500 peasant fighters. However, the rebels weren't as helpless as one would think. Even the poorest men could afford a stick. A swordsman still had to get within range to kill a man, and a clever peasant could use the stick as a lever to get the knight off his horse. Better-off peasants used hedging bills, modified by blacksmiths to become billhooks. They used them to yank knights off their horses. Others pounded nails into threshing flails to make war clubs. Best of all, many veterans of the 100 Years' War knew how to use the longbow, and during the uprising, peasant rebels had stolen 900 bows from the Tower of London. The two armies met outside the city to decide the fate of the Kingdom of England. Both sides bristled with weapons and trembled with anxiety. Fingers clung to longbow strings. Hands gripped at swords. Wat Tyler rode up to the king and shook him by the hand, familiar and relaxed. After greeting him as a brother, Wat Tyler presented the most radical demands yet. Not only freedom for the peasants, but the abolition of both the aristocracy and the senior clergy, with the exception of the Archbishop at Canterbury. Courts and police would be placed under local control, and money once controlled by the bishops and lords would be turned over to the peasants. All this 200 years before the Protestant Reformation, 400 years before the French Revolution, and 500 years before the Russian Revolution. As Tyler presented his demands, he played with his knife. We don't know if this was because he was tense or because he became too relaxed. Once again, King Richard II agreed to all demands with the caveat that the monarchy survive. On the verge of a complete social revolution, Wat Tyler asked for some water. He rinsed out his mouth, then spat out the water. Next, he asked for some beer. He drank it and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Very suddenly, one of the royal squires called Tyler the biggest thief in Kent. The argument escalated until Tyler ordered his men to lop off the squire's head. No one moved. Dead silence settled over the meeting place. The mayor of London rode forward, perhaps trying to reason with Tyler or maybe intending to provoke him. We don't know exactly what happened next, but a scuffle broke out. The mayor stabbed Wat in the back of the neck. Though Wat Tyler tried to ride back to the rebel army, he fell off his horse after 80 paces. The Kentish rebels tensed, ready to rain arrows down on the royal party. On the brink of disaster, 14-year-old King Richard rode towards the sea of rebel bowmen. He proclaimed that he would now lead the revolt, and he ordered them to gather at Clarkenwell. The peasants, who still trusted in the mystique of kingship as a divinely appointed fountain of justice, followed the king. A great sigh of relief came from both sides. The wounded Wat was taken to St. Bartholomew's Abbey. While the monks tried to stop Tyler's bleeding, armed nobles burst into the abbey, dragged Tyler into the streets, and chopped his head off. Meanwhile, loyalist forces within London gathered. If Richard had been playing for time, it worked very well. As Richard camped with the rebels at Clarkenwell, the king's men surrounded them. When they saw Tyler's head, the rebels threw down their weapons and begged the king for forgiveness. The peasants headed home, and the rebellion began to die out. However, that would not be the end of the bloodletting. King Richard II, who never had been on the peasants' side, organized a brutal backlash. Indeed, the events at Smithfield may well have been a ploy from the beginning. Though if it was, it had left King Richard II dangerously exposed. Regardless, thousands of rebels headed home, hoping to vanish, but a group of 200 gathered at the forest of Billericay to continue the rebellion by force. However, they were hunted down and slaughtered by armored knights. In the years that followed, hundreds of peasants would be murdered in extrajudicial executions as nobles settled scores from the Peasants' Revolt. Those not beheaded endured brandings with red-hot irons and suffered hands and feet chopped off. John Ball, whom Tyler planned to make Archbishop of Canterbury, was hung, drawn, and quartered. His last words as he died insisted on the justice of the Peasants' Revolt. Thomas Baker, who had started the revolt by confronting a brutal tax collector, suffered the same fate. Wealthier rebels, including some members of Parliament, received pardons. Yet, the Peasants' Revolt was more than just a tragic, wretched failure. The nobles did not forget the revolt. Though King Richard II and his uncle John of Gaunt remained in charge, they never tried to revive the poll tax, and they made no serious effort to restart the 100 Years' War during their lifetimes. No king or noble could simply pass laws without thinking about how the peasantry would react. Indeed, no British government would even try to pass another poll tax until Margaret Thatcher in 1990, and feudalism itself would not last more than a couple of generations. The Peasants' Revolt ended, but its legacy had just begun. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.